Case 1. Carly Madison Greg. March 19, 2024. A Tuesday afternoon in Brandon, Mississippi. Carly Madison Greg, just 14 years old, arrived home from school like she had 1,000 times before. Her mother, Ashley Smiley, a math teacher and respected figure in their tight-knit community, was waiting in the kitchen. It was supposed to be a routine conversation, the kind of mild confrontation that happens in households everywhere. Ashley had discovered something hidden in Carly's room, burner phones and contraband that suggested her daughter was living a double life she knew nothing about. But Carly wasn't interested in explaining herself. Within minutes of that confrontation, Ashley Smiley was dead, shot in the face with a .357 Magnum that Carly retrieved from her parents' bedroom. The gunshot echoed through the empty house, a single, uncatastrophic punctuation mark on what should have been a simple parenting moment. A mother tries to protect her child, and in return, she's executed in her own kitchen by the person she gave life to. Carly didn't panic. She didn't call for help. Instead, she did something that investigators would later describe as one of the most chilling acts they'd ever encountered. She took a selfie. Standing near her mother's body, Carly smiled for the camera, capturing the moment with the same casual ease a teenager might use to document a new outfit. Then, she texted her best friend, "You have to come over. You won't believe what just happened." When her stepfather, Heath Smiley, returned home later that evening, Carly was waiting. She ambushed him the moment he stepped through the door, firing multiple shots. Heath, a former law enforcement officer, was struck but survived by fighting back and fleeing the house. He would later testify that Carly showed no emotion during the attack, no rage, no fear, just cold calculation. Investigators quickly pieced together the sequence of events. The burner phones Ashley discovered weren't just tools for sneaking around. They were evidence of a life Carly had constructed entirely in the shadows, hidden from the parents who believed they knew her. When that facade crumbled, Carly made a choice: eliminate the threat. During the trial, psychologists debated whether Carly understood the permanence of what she had done. But the selfie told a different story. It wasn't taken in shock or confusion. It was taken in triumph, a visual trophy of the moment she decided her mother's life was less important than her secrets. Carly Madison Greg was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The question that haunts those who followed the case isn't about the sentence, it's about the smile. What kind of fracture exists inside a person who can grin over the body of the woman who raised them? Case 2. Cydney Powell, November 2020. Akron, Ohio. Cydney Powell was living two lives, and only one of them was real. To her mother, Brenda Powell, Cydney was a dedicated college student at the University of Mount Union, pursuing her degree with the same focus she'd shown throughout high school. But the truth was far darker. Cydney had been suspended months earlier for poor academic performance, a failure she couldn't bring herself to admit. So instead of confessing, she built an elaborate lie, leaving for classes each morning and returning home each evening as if nothing had changed. Brenda Powell was a respected figure in their community, a social worker who dedicated her life to helping others navigate their darkest moments. She believed in second chances, in rehabilitation, in the power of honest conversation. But Cydney knew that honesty would shatter the version of herself her mother still believed in. And on that November night, when the secret finally threatened to surface, Cydney made a decision that would destroy both their lives. It started in the kitchen. Brenda was preparing dinner when Cydney attacked her from behind with a cast-iron skillet, striking her mother repeatedly in the head. When Brenda fell to the floor, still conscious, still trying to understand why her daughter was doing this, Cydney retrieved a knife. She stabbed her mother multiple times, ensuring there would be no recovery, no conversation, no moment where the lie would be exposed. Cydney then staged the scene to look like a robbery, scattering items around the house and creating the appearance of forced entry. She called 911, her voice shaking with what sounded like genuine panic, reporting that she'd returned home to find her mother murdered. For a brief moment, investigators considered her story. But forensic evidence doesn't lie the way people do. Blood spatter patterns didn't match Cydney's version of events. Her injuries, minor cuts she claimed came from the intruder, were inconsistent with a struggle. And when detectives pressed harder, the elaborate construction Cydney had built began to collapse. She eventually confessed, admitting that she killed her mother to prevent the truth about her academic failure from coming out. Cydney Powell was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Brenda Powell spent her career helping people face their mistakes and move forward. Her daughter killed her to avoid doing exactly that. Case 3. Ruth Anne Viss. September 11, 2018. Washougal, Washington. A quiet Tuesday morning in a neighborhood where people still left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors. Ruth Anne Viss, just 14 years old, had been missing for 3 days. A runaway who'd slipped out of her foster home without a word, carrying nothing but a backpack and whatever anger had been building inside her. Her foster parents had filed a report, hoping she'd return on her own like she had before. But Ruth Anne wasn't planning to come back. She was planning something far worse. Roxanne Gaskell, a 72-year-old retired librarian, lived alone in a modest home on the edge of town. She was known for her kindness, the type of woman who baked cookies for neighborhood kids and volunteered at the local food bank every weekend. On that September morning, she answered a knock at her door and found a young girl standing on her porch, claiming she needed help. Roxanne, without hesitation, let her inside. It was a decision that would cost her everything. Within minutes, Ruth Anne attacked. She stabbed Roxanne 23 times with a kitchen knife, turning a simple act of compassion into a frenzied, brutal execution. Roxanne fought back. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms showed she tried to protect herself, but she was no match for the rage Ruth Anne unleashed. When it was over, Roxanne Gaskell lay dead in her own living room, and Ruth Anne stood over the body, already calculating her next move. She didn't flee immediately. Instead, Ruth Anne ransacked the house searching for valuables. She took Roxanne's purse, her wallet, and her credit cards. Then she left, or closing the door behind her as if she'd simply finished a routine visit. Over the next 48 hours, Ruth Anne went on a spending spree, using Roxanne's stolen cards at gas stations, convenience stores, and fast food restaurants across 2 counties. She bought snacks, clothes, and cigarettes, treating the murder like it was nothing more than an opportunity for a shopping trip. Surveillance footage captured Ruth Anne at multiple locations, her face clear on camera as she swiped the stolen cards without hesitation. When police arrested her 2 days later, she showed no remorse. In fact, she was almost casual about it, as if killing a stranger was just something that happened when you needed money. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Ruth Anne knew exactly what she was doing, that this wasn't a crime of passion or desperation, but cold, calculated violence. Ruth Anne Viss was sentenced to 37 years in prison. Roxanne Gaskell opened her door to help a child in need, and that single act of kindness became her final mistake. Case 4. Centoya Brown. August 6, 2004, Nashville, Tennessee. Centoya Brown was 16 years old, but she had already lived more trauma than most people experience in a lifetime. By the time she met Johnny Allen, a 43-year-old real estate agent, Centoya had been trafficked for sex by a violent pimp named Cutthroat, beaten regularly and forced into survival mode every single day. When Allen picked her up that August night, offering her money in exchange for sex, Centoya went with him. She didn't have a choice, or at least that's what she believed. But what happened inside Allen's home would spark a legal battle that lasted over a decade and divided the entire nation. Allen brought Centoya back to his house in the early hours of the morning. According to Centoya, once inside, she saw guns displayed on the walls and felt an overwhelming sense of danger. She claimed Allen reached under his bed for something, and in that moment, convinced he was going to kill her, she pulled out a gun she'd been carrying and shot him in the back of the head while he lay on the bed. Allen died instantly. Centoya then took his wallet, his truck, and fled back to the motel where her pimp was waiting. Prosecutors saw it differently. They argued that Allen never threatened Centoya, that he was asleep when she shot him, and that the murder was premeditated robbery, not self-defense. The guns on the wall, collector's items, the reach under the bed? Never proven. In their version, Centoya Brown was a calculating killer who executed a man in cold blood and stole his property. The trial was brief. Centoya, tried as an adult, Anand was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, 51 years before she'd even be eligible for parole. But as the years passed, her case became a rallying point. Advocates argued she was a victim of sex trafficking who acted out of fear, not malice. Celebrities, activists, and legal experts called for her release, insisting that a child sold for sex shouldn't spend her life behind bars for trying to survive. In 2019, after serving 15 years, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam granted Centoya clemency. She was released, her sentence commuted. But the question still lingers. Was Johnny Allen a predator who got what he deserved, or was he a victim of a murder that had nothing to do with self-defense? The answer depends entirely on who you ask. Case 5. Marissa Smith. March 14, 2021. A Sunday afternoon in a public park in Louisville, Kentucky. Families were out enjoying the early spring weather. Kids on swings, joggers on trails, the kind of unremarkable weekend scene that plays out in every American city. But beneath that surface normalcy, something darker was brewing. Two groups of teenagers, connected only through social media feuds and escalating online threats, had arranged to meet face to face. It was supposed to be a fight, a chance to settle their beef in person. What it became was a homicide. Marissa Smith was 16 years old, a high school junior with a history of volatile behavior and a reputation for not backing down. For weeks, she'd been exchanging hostile messages with members of a rival group, insults escalating into threats, threats hardening into promises. When the date and location were finalized, posted openly in group chats where dozens of people watched the drama unfold, Marissa showed up ready. She didn't come to argue. She came armed. The victim, a 17-year-old male whose name was withheld due to his age, arrived with his own group of friends. Witnesses later described the scene as chaotic from the start, shouting, shoving, dozens of teenagers circling like spectators at a gladiator match. Cell phones were out, recording everything, turning violence into content. And then, in the middle of the chaos, Marissa pulled out a knife. She didn't hesitate. She lunged forward and stabbed the victim once in the chest, a single, precise strike that severed a major artery. He collapsed within seconds, clutching the wound as blood poured onto the grass. His friends screamed for help, but it was too late. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but the damage was irreversible. He was pronounced dead at the hospital less than an hour later. Marissa fled the scene immediately, discarding the knife in a nearby trash can as she ran. But dozens of people had recorded the entire encounter. Within hours, police had video evidence from multiple angles, showing Marissa's face clearly as she committed the act. By the next morning, she was in custody. During interrogation, Marissa showed little emotion. She admitted to bringing the knife, admitted to the stabbing, but framed it as self-defense, claiming she felt threatened by the crowd. Prosecutors weren't buying it. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was premeditated. The fight was arranged days in advance, the weapon brought intentionally, and the attack executed without hesitation. The trial revealed the disturbing role social media played in the escalation. Screenshots of messages showed Marissa bragging about what she planned to do, promising violence to anyone who doubted her. The fight wasn't about defending herself. It was about proving dominance, about turning an online persona into real-world credibility. Marissa Smith was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. A teenager died in a public park because a feud that started with insults on a screen became a knife in his chest. Case 6. Nura Jackson, February 4, 2005. A quiet Thursday evening in a suburban neighborhood in Cook County, Illinois. Jennifer Jackson, a 47-year-old healthcare administrator, returned home from work expecting the same routine she'd followed for years. A quiet dinner, maybe some television, and an evening free from the constant tension that had been building between her and her daughter. But that night, the tension finally exploded. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, Jennifer Jackson was dead, stabbed over 50 times in her own home. Nura Jackson was 25 years old, still living under her mother's roof despite years of conflict over her lifestyle. Jennifer had tried everything, rules, boundaries, consequences, but Nura pushed back at every turn. She stayed out late, brought strangers into the house, and showed open contempt for her mother's authority. Friends of Jennifer later described the relationship as a powder keg, with both women refusing to back down. But no one expected it would end in murder. The attack happened in Jennifer's bedroom, late in the evening, after yet another argument about Nura's behavior. Witnesses would later testify that the two had been fighting for hours, voices escalating, doors slamming. And then, silence. What happened in that silence was so violent, so frenzied, that investigators initially suspected multiple attackers. Jennifer was stabbed over 50 times. Defensive wounds covering her hands and arms showed she fought desperately to protect herself, but the assault was relentless. Nura's story changed multiple times. At first, she claimed she wasn't home when it happened. Then she said an intruder must have broken in, but forensic evidence told a different story. Blood spatter patterns placed Nura in the room during the attack. Her fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, a kitchen knife taken from the drawer downstairs. And perhaps most damning, there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of any intruder at all. During the trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a daughter who resented her mother's control and saw murder as the only way to escape it. Nura's defense argued she'd been mentally unstable, pushed to a breaking point by years of familial pressure. But the jury didn't buy it. The sheer number of stab wounds, over 50, suggested something far beyond a momentary loss of control. This was rage, sustained and unrelenting. Nura Jackson was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jennifer Jackson spent years trying to guide her daughter toward a better life. In the end, that dedication cost her everything. The question that lingers isn't whether Nura killed her mother, it's whether she ever truly saw her as anything more than an obstacle. Case 7. Leysa Landrum and Rocky Almestica Jr. July 2009. A sweltering summer in Tampa, Florida. The kind of heat that makes people irritable, careless, that turns minor disputes into something darker. Leysa Landrum was 17 years old, dating Rocky Almestica Jr., a 19-year-old with a violent streak and a possessive grip on their relationship. But Rocky had a problem, a girl from his past who refused to disappear. Her name was Cassandra DeLeon, and she'd been involved with Rocky before Leysa came into the picture. Cassandra still had feelings for him, still reached out, still existed as a reminder of what Rocky's life looked like before Leysa. And for Leysa, that was unacceptable. The two of them talked about it for weeks, late-night conversations where jealousy twisted into something uglier. Leysa couldn't stand the thought of Cassandra still being part of Rocky's world, even peripherally. And Rocky, eager to prove his loyalty, agreed to eliminate the problem, not by cutting contact or moving on, but by making sure Cassandra disappeared permanently. They planned it together, mapping out every detail like it was a project for school rather than a murder. On the night of the killing, Rocky lured Cassandra to meet him under the pretense of reconciliation. She arrived expecting closure, maybe even a second chance. What she got was an ambush. Rocky and Leysa attacked her together, beating her, strangling her, ensuring she couldn't fight back or call for help. Cassandra died slowly, painfully, pleading for her life while the two people she thought she knew became her executioners. When it was over, they didn't panic. They didn't call the police or try to stage an accident. Instead, they wrapped Cassandra's body in trash bags and carried her to a dumpster behind a nearby apartment complex. They threw her inside like she was garbage, closing the lid and walking away as if they'd just taken out the trash after dinner. Then they went home, climbed into bed, and fell asleep. It took 3 days for someone to find Cassandra's body, a maintenance worker who noticed the smell coming from the dumpster and called authorities. By then, decomposition had begun, but forensic evidence quickly pointed to Rocky and Leysa. Witnesses had seen them with Cassandra that night. Text messages between the couple revealed their premeditation, discussing the murder in coded language they thought was clever, but was actually transparent. During the trial, prosecutors presented those messages to the jury, conversations where Leysa referred to Cassandra as the problem, and Rocky promised to take care of it. Defense attorneys tried to argue that Rocky acted alone and Leysa was simply present, but the evidence showed otherwise. Leysa was an active participant, not a bystander. She wanted Cassandra dead, and she helped make it happen. Both were convicted of first-degree murder. Rocky Almestica Jr. was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Leysa Landrum received the same sentence. Cassandra DeLeon's crime was being part of someone's past, and for that, she was murdered and discarded like trash by two people who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. Case 8, Cassie Bjorga and Johnny Ryder, April 2015. A rural farmhouse in Rusk County, Texas, the kind of place where neighbors are miles apart, where privacy is absolute, and where screams go unheard. Cassie Bjorga was 19 years old, living with her grandparents, who had taken her in after years of instability in her biological parents' home. Wayne and Sharon Bjorga were retired, devoting their final years to raising a granddaughter they hoped would find stability under their roof. But Cassie had other plans. She wanted freedom, money, and a life without rules. And her boyfriend, Johnny Ryder, 21 and equally aimless, was willing to help her get it. The couple had been talking about it for weeks, how easy it would be, how much they could gain, how no one would ever suspect them. Wayne and Sharon trusted Cassie completely, never imagining that the girl they'd sacrificed so much for was plotting their deaths. On the night of the murders, Cassie and Johnny waited until the elderly couple was asleep, then crept into their bedroom armed with a hammer and a knife. Wayne died first, struck repeatedly in the head with the hammer before he could fully wake. Sharon tried to fight back, screaming, clawing, doing anything to survive, but Johnny stabbed her multiple times until she stopped moving. When it was over, the bedroom looked like a slaughterhouse. Blood on the walls, the floor, the bedding. But instead of fleeing or panicking, Cassie and Johnny did something investigators would later describe as one of the most disturbing acts they'd ever encountered. They sealed the room. They closed the bedroom door, locked it, and went on with their lives as if nothing had happened. Over the next 2 weeks, Cassie and Johnny threw parties in the house, inviting friends over, drinking, smoking, blasting music through the walls while Wayne and Sharon's bodies decomposed just upstairs. The smell was unbearable. But when guests asked about it, Cassie blamed it on a plumbing issue or dead animals in the walls. No one questioned it. Why would they? Eventually, a concerned relative who hadn't heard from Wayne and Sharon in weeks called for a welfare check. When deputies arrived, Cassie greeted them at the door with a smile, insisting everything was fine. But the smell was overwhelming, and officers pushed past her into the house. They found the locked bedroom upstairs, forced it open, and discovered the bodies, bloated, rotting, covered in maggots. Forensic evidence made it clear this wasn't a sudden act of violence, but a calculated execution, followed by weeks of callous indifference. Text messages between Cassie and Johnny revealed they'd planned the murders to gain control of the house and Wayne's savings. They talked about the killings casually, even joking about the smell. Both were convicted of capital murder. Johnny Ryder was sentenced to life without parole. Cassie Bjorga received the same. Wayne and Sharon Bjorga gave their granddaughter a home, and she repaid them by turning it into their tomb while she partied above their corpses. Case 9. Shelia and Rachel Schoaf, July 6, 2012. A summer night in Star City, West Virginia. The kind of night where teenagers stay out late, windows down, music playing, chasing whatever fleeting freedom exists before adulthood arrives. Skylar Neese was 16 years old, climbing out of her bedroom window just after midnight to meet her two best friends, Shelia and Rachel Schoaf. The three of them had been inseparable for years, the kind of trio that posted matching photos online and finished each other's sentences. Skylar trusted them completely. That trust would be the last mistake she ever made. Shelia and Rachel picked Skylar up in Shelia's car, telling her they were going for a drive to smoke weed and hang out like they'd done 100 times before. Skylar climbed into the back seat laughing, probably talking about boys or school or whatever seemed important in that moment. She had no idea that her two closest friends had spent weeks planning her murder, no idea that the drive wasn't about friendship. It was about getting her somewhere isolated, somewhere no one would hear her scream. They drove to a remote area in Pennsylvania, about 30 minutes from Skylar's home, pulling off onto a dirt road surrounded by dense woods. When the car stopped, Shelia and Rachel told Skylar they needed to get out and stretch. The three of them walked into the trees, and then, without warning, Rachel attacked. She pulled out a kitchen knife and stabbed Skylar in the side. Skylar screamed, stumbling backward, trying to understand why her best friend was doing this. Then, Shelia joined in. The two girls stabbed Skylar repeatedly, taking turns, as both participating equally in the execution. Skylar begged them to stop, pleading, asking why they were doing this, but they didn't answer. They just kept stabbing until Skylar collapsed, bleeding out onto the forest floor. When she finally stopped moving, Shelia and Rachel stood over the body, catching their breath, and then they did what any good friends would do after a long night. They went to get cleaning supplies. They covered Skylar's body with branches and leaves, trying to hide the evidence, then drove to a convenience store to buy bleach and paper towels. They cleaned the blood out of the car, disposed of their clothes, and returned home as if nothing had happened. The next morning, when Skylar's parents reported her missing, Shelia and Rachel joined the search efforts. They posted on social media and begging for Skylar's safe return, even appearing on local news pleading for information. For 6 months, they maintained the lie, but Rachel eventually cracked. The guilt became unbearable, and she confessed to authorities, leading them to Skylar's body still hidden in the woods where they'd left her. When investigators asked why they did it, Rachel's answer was chilling in its simplicity. We didn't like her anymore. That was it. No grand motive, no secret betrayal, no explosive fight. They just decided Skylar was annoying, and rather than ending the friendship like normal people, they decided to end her life instead. During the trial, prosecutors revealed text messages between Shelia and Rachel, where they discussed the murder in advance, debating logistics like they were planning a surprise party. Shelia Eddy was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Rachel Schoaf, who cooperated with authorities, received 30 years with parole eligibility after 10. Skylar Neese trusted her best friends, and they killed her because they didn't want to be friends anymore. Case 10. Amber Mary Bray and Jeffrey Ayers, September 24, 2014. A quiet Wednesday evening in Kokomo, Indiana. Amber Bray was 18 years old, an honors student with a promising future and a reputation for being responsible, mature beyond her years. Her mother, Michaela Meave, was proud of her, proud of the grades, the scholarships, the bright trajectory Amber seemed to be following. But beneath that polished surface, Amber was drowning in debt and desperation, and she'd found a solution that would solve all her problems at once, a $310,000 life insurance policy her mother had taken out years earlier. The only obstacle was that Michaela needed to be dead for Amber to collect. Amber didn't act alone. Her boyfriend, Jeffrey Ayers, 20 years old and equally motivated by greed, became her accomplice. The two of them spent weeks planning the murder, discussing how to make it look like an accident or a robbery, how to avoid suspicion, how to get away with it cleanly. They convinced themselves it would be easy, that grief would make Amber look innocent, that no one would suspect a straight-A student of killing her own mother for money. On the night of the murder, Jeffrey came to the house while Michaela was home alone. Amber had given him a key, letting him inside without triggering any alarms or forcing entry. Michaela was in the living room, probably reading or watching television, when Jeffrey attacked. He beat her with a crowbar, striking her repeatedly in the head until she stopped moving. The assault was brutal, designed to ensure there would be no survival, no chance for Michaela to identify her attacker or call for help. When Amber arrived home later that evening, she found her mother's body and called 911, her voice shaking with what sounded like genuine shock. She told the dispatcher she'd come home to find her mother murdered, that the door was unlocked, that it must have been a robbery. For a brief moment, investigators considered her story. But financial records don't lie, and neither do cell phone towers. Detectives discovered the life insurance policy almost immediately, $310,000 payable to Amber upon her mother's death. They traced Jeffrey's cell phone to the area around Amber's house at the exact time of the murder. And when they searched Jeffrey's car, they found the crowbar, still stained with Michaela's blood, hidden under the back seat. He'd kept it like a trophy, too arrogant to dispose of the evidence properly. During interrogation, Jeffrey confessed, admitting that Amber had planned the entire thing and recruited him to carry it out. She'd promised him a cut of the insurance money, enough to start a new life together. But when faced with the evidence, Amber maintained her innocence, insisting she had nothing to do with it, that Jeffrey acted alone. The jury didn't believe her. Both were convicted of first-degree murder. Jeffrey Ayers was sentenced to 65 years in prison. Amber Bray received 55 years. Michaela Meave took out a life insurance policy to protect her daughter's future, never imagining that policy would become the motive for her own execution.